Hi, welcome to another Austin Software Cooperatives. This is July 2024. We're going to continue with Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism. This is part two. We'll see how far we get today. Watson, take it away.
Thanks, Taylor. I am going to do a small review of some of the concepts we learned in chapter one before we get into chapter two. And the specific concepts I'm going to go over, there's three levels. The first one is it's value. We're going to two types of value, two types of labor, and two types of power. So there is, as far as labor, as far as value, there is exchange value and experiential value. You can think of the difference as when you go to watch a movie, the ticket price you pay reflects the movie's exchange value, but that's quite separate from the pleasure it gives you, which you might call the experiential value. So exchange value, experiential value. He's contrasting these, and it's kind of his introduction to capitalism, his view. Now we got labor. You got experiential labor, and you got commodity labor. Um, the monetary reward, you can call that the commodity side, and here's the experiential side. Labor's second value that his mother first alerted to him considered the brilliant idea conjured up by a group of brainstorming architects employed by a multinational construction firm, or the positive vibes a waiter emits on the restaurant floor, or the teacher's tear of joy when a challenged pupil solves a difficult math problem. None of these are ever commodified. That is the experiential labor. So it's stuff that cannot be captured. He's going to bring it up again in the next chapter. Right. So now, a little teasing that out a little bit more. One of his view, and which is kind of a twist on a Marxist view, uh, he's saying that capitalism's secret, the uncommodifiable sweat, effort, inspiration, goodwill, care, and tears of employees are what breathe exchange value in the commodities that employers then flog to their eager customers. This is actually what makes the building of a restaurant or school desirable. So here, the secret power of employers to extract any surplus, either from the highly skilled or from the uninspired, repetitive, robotic work. They must pay for the workers' time, which is the commodity labor, but they cannot actually buy the sweat or flair, which is the experiential labor. He's saying that this is a secret power of the employers. Capitalists owe their profits to the inability, so paradoxically, the inability to the impossibility of buying experiential labor directly. And yet, what a boon to suffer from such an incapacity. It's ultimately they who pocket the difference between the exchange value, and they pay the employees in exchange for their commodity labor and the exchange value of the commodities created thanks to their experiential labor. In other words, labor's dual nature is what gives rise to profit. All right. So, in my other words, if you were able to actually pay for all of the value through a wage, there would be no profit. You cannot pay for someone's, like the teacher's tier, like they're saying, the extra effort, the inspiration, all of that. Since you can't pay for it, not since you don't want to pay, but since you can't, that is what allows for the profit to happen, the extra value and the surplus to be gone to the employer. So that's what allows for capital. Last concept is power. There's two different types of power, and commodity capital. Uh, let's see here. Yeah, or two different types of capital, I should say. So commodity capital, like a fishing rod, a tractor, a company server, or any good that is produced to be used in the production of other commodities. So it's something you can use to produce other things. The second nature of capital is nothing like a commodity. Suppose you discover that you possess tools that you need in order to produce the stuff that for your family's survival, or he does that for your family's survival, such as the aforementioned fishing rod, tractor server. Suddenly, they required the power to make you do things. For example, to work for you in exchange for the use of the tools. So capital, in short, is both a thing, commodity capital, and a force, the power capital. Just as labor is split between commodity labor and experiential labor, you kind of can tell this, that someone that owns the tools, they have a certain amount of power over whatever it is that needs those tools to be created. Obviously your employer has power over you. He goes over these different concepts in the next chapter. Any questions so far before I go? All right. So this next chapter, he's talking about the first, what he's calling the first, or a metamorphosis of capitalism, a couple of them. And so I guess an overview, he's saying that capitalism went obviously from feudalism, which he's going to talk about a little bit, into another form during World War II. He's going to describe that. After World War II, he's saying that capitalism was not the same way as it was before. So he's going to talk about that with his technostructure, and he's going to cite some quotes, some people, and stuff like that. And then that's the setup to get into the next metamorphosis. I could say offhand that people that critique capitalism, on one side, well, yeah, on one side, it's it spurs inequality. It has inefficiencies and all these other things. There's all these other critiques on the negative side. On the, you can kind of say almost like a positive side, they marvel at capitalism's ability to change and adapt to the environment that it's in. So he's kind of following in that tradition in his own way, with his way of describing the metamorphosis and evolution of capitalism. All right, so he's going to describe. I just finished talking about the metamorphosis. Let's get into the first kind of a description. He uses Mad Men. I don't know if anybody watched Mad Men. I never watched it. I've heard about it. People recommend it, but I've never watched it. It's basically about advertisers and in the 60s and how they changed things or how they operated on the day to day. So it was a drama or what have you. He uses it as a description for, at the greater scale, one of the metamorphoses of capitalism. And he continues to refer back to it. So there was someone named Draper in the show that was the main advertiser, and they basically, long story short, they basically tease out the desire and create or manufacture desire in people for things that they don't need. And he uses that as one of the attributes of the next metamorphosis of capitalism. So we can skip through some of this. He said, like I said, he said it's a turning point for capitalism, this mass commercialization of nostalgia. And here's kind of some of the rationale for this metamorphosis. So capitalism had begun as a relentless, a little bit bigger, drive to put a price on things that once had no price. Common lands, human labor, and all the stuff that families once produced for their own consumption. If there was something that humans shared and enjoyed, but which had no price and mattered to us only for its intrinsic or experiential value, like Granny's handcrafted tablecloth or beautiful sunset or beguiling song, capitalism found a way to commodify it to subjugate its experiential value to exchange value. Right? Okay. So now, having assimilated every resource, crop, and artifact it could, capitalism has since gone on to commodify the airwaves, women's wombs, art, genotypes, asteroids, and even space itself. Okay, so each time the onslaught of exchange value has overcome its defenses, experiential value has gone underground to the catacombs of our psyche. This is the metamorphosis Don Draper, or more accurately, the men and women of Mammon. It's based on discovered it, retrieved it, and commodified it. So he's talking about what they did, and he kind of sums it up with saying it's attention that they were able to commodify. Let's see what else here. Right here. Draper captures the essence of capitalism's post-war transformation, discovery of a new market, namely the market for our attention, grafted onto the shiny new industrial structure, but all within a system that remains fully reliant on labor's dual nature. And kind of, this is also a throwback to what we are talking about, experiential labor. His bosses would love to be able to purchase his ideas without having to tolerate him lounging around the office half drunk, in the language of a previous chapter, but they would jump at the opportunity to buy Draper's experiential labor directly. So this is as a side note. Even within this story, you can see experiential labor and kind of a flaunting of it. Someone that's so good that they can actually lounge around at work, and but they can't really purchase his insight and his creativity. That's really more of a side note. Right. So this is more on that evolution. Capitalism must commodify everything it touches, but at the same time, high exchange value and thus serious profits depend on failing to do so fully. You'll not only does this author Yanis Varoufakis say this, but basically every single that I've seen, like with an almost Marxian tradition author, they're going to talk about this failure and this paradox is the source of its power, of capitalism's power, and it evolves. So this failure to account for what he's calling exchange value. If it is to avoid the fate of a school of predators that devours prey so efficiently that it starves to death, capitalism relies on there being an endless supply of experiential values for its exchange values to trounce and cannibalize. So things, that's another, I would say, trend or theme. It needs to continuously find new sources, resources to devour, and kind of implied there is that those resources are going to run out eventually, and then it'll stop dead. But this transformation was, oh, there's a whole brand new resource, attention. So it found a way to modify itself and um, capitalize on attention, right? All right, so that's retrieving the irretrievable. Any questions so far? This is kind of main next chapters, kind of, or sorry, sections, kind of one of the main sections of the whole thing. All All right.
Well, I like that he's touching on attention because it really reminds me of Gary Vee. I don't know if you guys are familiar. So, I mean, I followed at some point, 2015 or 16, Gary Vee, famous digital marketer
Yeah.
guy, right? Like very gung-ho capitalist. And he talks, and his brilliance is that he saw it very early on that it was about attention. And he was always like back in the day, and people were like, oh, this guy's always, yeah, it's attention, attention. And in reality, he didn't talk in Marxian terms, right? But what he was talking about is commodifying, being able to capture that attention, paying for it, and doing it at what he said, what is that he day traded on attention. So he was already kind of hinting at this.
Yeah. Yeah. Gary's always keynoting at South by. I don't know if he did this year, but he's always there. Oh, they love him.
Oh yeah.
uh Anyone else? This next one is kind of a little elusive. The concepts try to I'm gonna do my best to try to summarize this. Um so he wants to get this idea of what a technostructure is. And so keep in mind that this is a kind of a counterintuitively, it's kind of a planned economy. So he's in the end of this section, he's making an argument. He's going to come to a conclusion that during World War II and after World War II, we were in somewhat of a planned economy. So centralized, planned. So that, pretty shocking, I would say, shocking or comment. So let's get into it. Um, he starts out talking about Thomas Edison doing the shock and awe, for he basically brought out a live elephant and electrocuted it and killed it in front of everyone, and then said, "Oh, this is what his competitor Westinghouse did. His method of electricity, works that way, and it's not safe." It's like, oh my gosh, But that whole attention uh, game, he kind of, you could say that, he's, I don't know, I don't want to say a pioneer of it, but goes, at least goes back to him. But having said that, Thomas Edison is, I don't know if people know, but he's the one that, created GE. That's his company. So General Electric, right? So, which is still around today, right? So Westinghouse was a competitor. And so this first part of the technostructure, so you have the big companies, so big companies like GE, and big finance. They kind of were symbiotic and grew up together. So the problem is that none of capitalism's early institutions, specifically its banks and share markets, were ready for such corporate empires, like saying like a GE. The banks were too small and too fragile, and the share markets too thin, too illiquid to provide the kind of funds Edison needed to build the famous Pearl Street power station, let alone the rest of his electricity grid. To produce the rivers of credit necessary to fund the Edisons, the Westinghouses, and the Fords of early 20th century capitalism, small banks merged to form larger ones and lent either to the industrialists directly or to speculators eager to buy shares in the new corporations. Right, so power mega firms and megawatts translated to mega profits, created the first mega debts, and formed a vast overdraft facilities for the Edisons. Right, so that was the emergence of big finance, which grew up alongside big business in order to lend it monies borrowed effectively from the future. Okay, so again, this concept of going into the big and it all being this, in the end, he's saying it's a public-private entity. All right, now we have that. Now let's go into here. Going to World War II, Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor. U.S. government began to emulate the Soviet Union. Oh, what is that talking about? Well, when it did, let's go over here and talk about that. All right. Under President Roosevelt, the U.S. government's deal with big business was simple. They would produce what was necessary to win the war. In exchange, the state would reward them with four incredible gifts. The state guaranteed sales, translating into state guaranteed profits. So, state guaranteed profits, like planes, tanks, all this. Freedom from competition, since prices were fixed by the government. Okay, definitely central planned. Thus, huge government fund scientific research. I'm sorry, third, huge government funded scientific research like the Manhattan Project, jet propulsion, that provided big business with wonderful new innovations and a pool of highly skilled scientific personnel to recruit from during and after the war. And then also, I guess after the Depression, big companies weren't looking so well, and after World War II, it offered them to be patriotic. And so those four things. All right, so we have that going on in the war. His argument is that after the war, they wanted to keep the party going. So there was someone in charge of doing that. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith, I think, whose job literally was to decide the price of everything, to fend off inflation, and to ensure a smooth economic transition from wartime to peacetime. American capitalism was run according to Soviet planning principles, with the important exception that the networked factories remained under private ownership of big business. Right. So the heroic entrepreneur at the helm of the corporation and democratic elected politician at the head of government had been both usurped by this new private public decision-making network, whose values and priorities and needed survival boiled down to one thing: survival and growth of the conglomerates. Now that with the war, with its infinite demand for stuff and technologies was over, Galbraith called this nexus the technostructure. So this is a name from that economist that was in charge for the transition from World War II to after World War II. Profitability remained essential for the army of technicians and influence-wielding employees making up the technostructure. Nevertheless, profit was no longer their top priority. As with all bureaucracies, the primary goal was to keep the underlings employed and busy. This was meant that they had not merely to avoid the shrinking of the conglomerates at the war's end, but to grow them. So their whole point was to stay existing. Like the companies were now bigger, and like a bureaucrat. So a lot of people will critique someone in government. They're not about profit; they're about existence. So, kind of the joke, which is not really a joke, the critique of use it or lose it in your budget. Just trying to make sure that if you have a budget, use all of it by the end of the year or end of the budget season. Otherwise, you're going to lose it. Bureaucrats more cares about that than about profit. So, given that, so we have this big technostructure, and they're producing things, and it's kind of his argument is that the use it or lose it, and all of this stuff like that. The new dealers and government took upon themselves to help the technostructure secure foreign customers. Right, as we see, it triggered another of the great metamorphoses of the 20th century capitalism. Right, opening the technostructure's eyes to the boundless possibilities of founding a new market for the attention and new bed of raw emotion. And we're going to see that's the technostructure. So you got big business, big finance, and they need to, they're producing things. So now we're going to get into the next problem. This global plan is going to get probably where we need to go for more of the solution or the evolution of what's going on. This is when Thomas Edison was doing the killing of that elephant, attention of the people. Let's go through this. Okay, well, I mean, this is kind of one of the statements. The rise of the technostructure transformed American capitalism from a decentralized market society to a centralized economy with markets. So decentralized market society to centralized economy that just so happens to have markets. The problem was that America's industrial capacity had grown so much during the war that to keep its factories busy and its workers in jobs, they had to produce a lot more stuff than Americans alone could absorb. So foreign markets had to be found. All right, that's what we needed to get out of that. Any questions so far before we get into this global plan? And then we're going to start getting to two big transformations that can kind of let you understand most of it. This is non-controversial, this part. Some of what he was saying, I think, is a little controversial. Does anybody think any of this is controversial so far? Like challengeable, not true? All right, let's go. Important section. So we're going to talk about the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system was the audacious global financial system devised by the New Dealers in 1944, whose purpose was noble: to thwart the Great Depression's return after the war had ended. Its strategy, however, was perhaps less so. It aimed to append post-war Europe and Japan to America's gleaming new war economy. And we're going to talk about this Bretton Woods system and what it is. And so, but the whole reason why it became to exist is the war. So, or yeah. So Washington understood that its first task would be to remonetize Europe, literally to provide them with money. Why? The New Dealers knew that once the German armies had been defeated, Europe would lie in ruins, its people penniless. Right? All right. So their first task was to remonetize Europe, literally to provide them with money to spend in order to get their economies running again. That was easier said than done. With Europe's gold either spent or stolen, the factory's infrastructure turned into rubble, so on and so forth. Europe needed much more than freshly minted paper money. Something had to instill the new notes with value. So this type of talk, I think, gets lost on people. It's lost in me, where it's like instill with new value, all of that. So they needed much more than freshly minted paper money. After all, what gives currency value but the economy that stands behind it? All right, let's tease that out a little bit more. One thing that could circumvent the problem, the dollar. The financial project of the Bretton Woods system was bold: to dollarize the currencies of Europe and Japan by linking European currencies to the yen to the dollar with fixed exchange rates. We're going to come back to that. Hence, the 30 drachmas, that's Greece, to $1, whose demise was, he's talking to his father, disturbed in 1975. In essence, it was a global currency union based on the US dollar. With the mighty US economy standing behind them, the currencies would retain a significant and stable value. Okay. This is important, comes back again. There had to be limits to how many dollars one could get for one's funny money. Funny money being, okay, we just printed this. Here you go. Greek drachmas, Italian lire. I don't know how you say that. These limits were known as capital controls, restrictions on the movement of money from one currency to another. Oh, why would you need that? They made the life of bankers wonderfully boring by denying them the opportunity to speculate on the shifts in the relative value of currencies, which they would have otherwise done by shifting large quantities of money from one currency to another, from one country to another. That was, of course, intentional, the capital controls, having been burned by the 1929 catastrophe. The new dealers wanted bankers to live in a straitjacket of capital controls and almost fixed interest rates, with only tiny wiggle room of 1% here or there. So this here, I think, is, well, it's definitely important to arguments later. This capital controls Bretton Woods system saying, okay, we're going to print money for you, Europe, you, Japan. We're going to bring you out of, the dire straits you're in from World War II, and you're going to use our dollar. But you got a problem. The bankers already know how to game this system. They can do speculation on the currencies. Oh, you want to peg your money to our dollar? We know how to play. You know how to do speculation and really destroy things like 1929. But they said, nope, we're not going to allow that. We're going to put capital controls. So you cannot do this. All right. And they made sure that no one was doing that. All right. The dazzling design, America's global plan to remake Europe and Japan in the image of its techno structure led to capitalism's golden age from the war's end until 1971. America, Europe, and Japan enjoyed low unemployment, low inflation, high growth, and massively diminished inequality. All right. But all of this relied on one crucial factor. For the dollar to be the apple of everyone's eye at the fixed exchange rates the Bretton Woods system guaranteed, America had to be a surplus amassing country, meaning it had to sell more goods and services to the rest of the world than it imported. Now, everybody kind of knows now that we are at a surplus deficit. Like, we don't make anything, people say now, except for like weapons. So we relied on that. As long as America was a major surplus nation, Bretton Woods was safe. That's why by the late 1960s, Bretton Woods system was dead in the water. The reasons: three developments which caused America to lose its trade surplus and become chronically deficit. So he says it's Vietnam War, Great Society program by Lyndon Johnson, and Japan and Germany's. Normally, this is what people think. Japan and Germany's factories surpassed America's in terms of quality. All right, now finally here, and then it's the end of the section. The 15th of August, 1971, President Nixon announced the ejection of Europe and Japan from the dollar zone. Bretton Woods was dead. Okay, what is that? To be more precise, Nixon announced the rescindment of United States obligation under the Bretton Woods system to redeem any quantity of the US dollar for gold at the fixed price of $35 an ounce. However, in effect, he is ending the fixed exchange rate between the dollar and the currencies of Europe and Japan. To stun European leaders, the Treasury Secretary uttered the words, "The dollar is our currency and your problem." So, how many people knew about this, right? Who know about that? We went off the gold standard, but didn't know about this here. Really, what mattered was this. We are no longer redeeming. You all cannot redeem the dollar anymore. That is why. Well, he's saying that's why. Any comments so far? So this is going to be, we're going to get into how the system now works. Of course, a lot of speculation how the system now works after this, and then he's going to say, "Now you're ready to talk about Well, I say how the system now, how the system worked before what he's calling cloud capital. And then we're getting a cloud capital. So he's having to do all this in order to even get to cloud, the critique of cloud capital. So any questions so far about this global Bretton Woods system portion? All right. So we're off the gold standard now. This section is going to talk about speculation a little bit, just to give you some idea of numbers that are mind-blowing and just don't even seem real. So 2002, 30 years after the Nixon shock, that Nixon shock was this 1971 get off the gold standard, also telling Europe and Japan, oh, well, we're not redeeming for dollar or gold anymore. So, and it's going to get into, we're going to get into, I don't know why he doesn't have that here, but in the next section, we're going to get into what happened, why that worked, in quotes, worked. All right. So, 2002, Nixon shock, $50 trillion, the total amount of income is $50 trillion. The same year, financiers around the world wagered 70 trillion, right? So $70 trillion were getting betted on. By 2007, humanity's total income had risen. So that was 2002, 50 trillion and 70. By 2007, humanity's total income had risen from 50 to 75 trillion, 33% over 5 years. But the sum of the bets in the global market are gone from 70 trillion to 750 trillion, 1,000%. All right. What was that all about? So, a description of financial instruments such as options, derivatives, weapons of potential mass financial destruction. Warren Buffett called them that. And these instruments, those options, had been available under the Bretton Woods, but it was only once the Bretton Woods system had died that the bankers, liberated from their New Deal chains, were allowed to bet on the stock exchange, first with other people's money and later with money effectively conjured from thin air, lent in astronomical sums by the banks. So remember the capital controls, the speculation of the money and all that stuff with the Bretton Woods, they said, no, you can't. We know you like to play. That game on at this point. And so we don't need to talk about this. All right. This is based on understanding of Bretton Woods and then also taking off that 1971, some stuff's not redeemable by gold. Now it's really printing money. It's game on. Right. All right. So
what's the timing between when it was those rules were removed and then things really get wild?
Bretton Woods was after World War II, all the way to 1971. 1971 was the getting off what people call getting off the gold standard. He's saying it's getting off the gold standard and also telling Europe and Japan, oh, well, I know you were buying dollars, but too bad. We're not giving you gold for it if you try to redeem it. Then that time, I don't know why he didn't describe it before he talked about this, talking about in the next section. That's when there were other controls put in, not controls to stop, but controls to make other countries buy the dollar. Oh. So we're going to talk about that. And that's still going on till a big one just stopped last month or this month in July. So it's quite interesting to talk about. But why the significance in 2000? So he's saying between 2000 to 2007, he didn't say why, this was happening. We had a couple big banks go under in the 90s. And so it was kind of like maybe they were just learning. But no. I think, all right, yeah. So he makes the argument. Is he doing it in this chapter? No, he does it in the next one. He talks about technology allowing for the options to be more sophisticated, so sophisticated. I think maybe I just skipped over it. They were so sophisticated that the people couldn't understand what they were, and that I think that's his argument of why it's in the 2000s. It starts to get even more of a game. Yeah,
That
I'm pretty
makes
sure.
sense.
Yeah,
So the technology advancements had to catch up with what they were wanting to really do.
yeah, yeah. So these are the numbers. He's prepping us with these numbers, and then let's get into, I believe, is it going to be in here? No, he's going to talk about the trade deficit here, and he's going to talk about the technology maybe later. All right. So U.S. trade deficit. All right. So what is this all about? And he calls the United States the global minotaur. So you've got, what is it, the body of a horse, or the head of a horse, the body of a human, something like that, whatever it is. Or the head, no, that's the head of a human, or upper body of a human, and the body of a horse. I forget. Um, so let's go here. The new American Minotaur's appetite kept the gleaming German factories busy. It gobbled up everything they produced, so on and so forth. In return, the foreign owners of these distant factories sent their profits, cash back to Wall Street to be invested, so on and forth, so forth. So this is when we're still this is when we start gobbling everything up. Now, sooner or later, the dollar gold exchange rate, artificially set at a fixed $35 an ounce at 1944, would depreciate. At that point, the stash of dollars would buy less gold. Naturally, they would begin eagerly exchanging their dollars for American gold. Before that happened, had this continued, the United States would have run out of gold. Nixon shock stopped the rot. Okay, so this part right here, that 1971, he's saying, oh no, we had to do that. And because of this reason here, but people are going to start exchanging the gold for the dollar. Europe and Japan and whoever else. So, but what did he implement, or what did they implement? All right. Once they lost their fixed exchange with the dollar value of European and Japanese money began fluctuating wildly like driftwood. The dollar became the only safe harbor. Why? Courtesy of its exorbitant privilege, namely that if any French, Japanese, or Indonesian company, indeed anyone, wanted to import oil, copper, steel, or even just space on the freight ship, they had to pay in dollars, right? So I knew about the oil. I didn't know about these other ones. Copper, steel, or freight on the space on the freight ship and all that. They had to pay in dollars. The United States was therefore the only country in the world whose currency was in demand, even by people who did not want to buy anything from it. That's why, as a dark cloud of uncertainty descended upon Europe and Japan's economic future, the world of finance responded by clamoring to turn their savings into dollars. Okay, so this is the Minotaur. Like, how can you have a country that doesn't make anything still be wealthy? Everybody has to buy their dollars. Why? Well, one, I know this one, Saudi Arabia and I want to say OPEC altogether in that 70s, that same 1971 area time, he said, we will protect you. We'll give you, you can buy our weapons, number one, but also we'll protect you, but make everyone buy in dollars. That was 1971. And these other ones, he didn't provide any reference. I would have loved if he did. but he didn't. But I need to go look that up. So we are now, by the way, off of this. Saudi Arabia is now selling in you can buy it in rupees, you can buy it in other, yuan, all that oil. So this is what allowed there to still be all this capital or this money. So and then so the dollar depreciated fast as anticipated, but curiously, that was the moment that the dollar regained its mojo. How? Shortly after the dollar was decoupled from gold, Europe's currencies were decoupled from the dollar. All right, so after this portion, the dollar became king and queen again. The Nixon shock produced a magic trick for the ages. The country going deeper and deeper into the red was the country whose currency, the dollar, was becoming more and more hegemonic. This was the epitome of a paradox. All right. And then he has this other argument. So there's another reason why the dollar's hegemony grew: the intentional impoverishment of America's working class. To exercise its fully magnetic powers over foreign capital, profit margins in the United States had to catch up with profit rates in Germany and Japan. A quick and dirty way to do this was to suppress American wages. Cheaper labor markets for lower costs makes for larger margins. It's no coincidence that to this day, American working class earnings languish. All right. Below their 1974 levels. So this stuff like this is people just, it's unbelievable. So you have less earning power than your parents. All right, so now I mean, it's kind of easy to see because people had single parent households and were able to buy homes and all that in the 70s. And you think of it like that, and now you have dual family and they're at the same or less. Dual earners in the home. So, any questions so far? All right, get through this thing. We got controlled disintegration. Let's go real quick. This is part of his. Does he talk about Volcker? Yeah. Okay, yeah. In the 1978 speech, Paul Volcker explained succinctly and cynically what they were up to. So he's kind of reading between the lines here. He's saying, we did that on purpose. All right. So a controlled disintegration in the world economy is a legitimate objective for the 1980s. And that's exactly what the Nixon shock was meant to do. The Bretton Woods system was demolished to make way for America's global minotaur. That is, again, you have to buy in our dollar, we're not going to produce anything. So in Volcker's own words from the same speech, balancing the requirements of a stable international system against the desirability of retaining freedom of action for national policy, a number of countries, including the United States, opted for the latter. So he's saying we wanted to retain the freedom of action for national policy against balancing the stable international system. I want to say Volcker was, I forget, like Treasury Secretary or something. Or no, he was in charge of the Fed, I think, back then. So Volcker was he was enthusiastically erecting the most unstable international system possible, founded on ceaselessly ballooning deficits, debts, and gambles. Their controlled disintegration of the Bretton Woods system would soon complete the new global system most people refer to as globalization or financialization. All right, let's see if we can get through the rest of this. This is when he starts talking about the computers. All right, controlled disintegration. And he's gonna, so I didn't see any references for this. It would be nice. So Volcker's controlled disintegration of the old system required beyond the neutering of trade unions and engineered recession in order to reduce workers' bargaining power and the elimination of the shackles that President Roosevelt had slapped on bankers to restrain their recklessness. As with every systemic transformation that hurts countless people, the cruelties necessary to bring it about had to be bathed in the light of liberating, redemptive ideology. That's where neoliberalism came in. We could talk a little bit about that. He doesn't really go into a strong definition of it. His definition, I should say. So here's the where we're talking about, which got stronger and stronger through the 90s and into the 2000s. Computers allowed financiers to complicate their gambles immensely. All right. Instead of a simple option to sell boring old shares to Jill, Jack could now buy much more snazzier options called derivatives. Right. And so if that were not complex enough, and this is where I would say the 2000s start coming into play, Jack could also buy derivative amounting to the option to buy a bundle of many such derivatives that some supercomputer would create. By the time these derivatives containing other derivatives had come out of the computer, not even the genius financial engineer who created them could understand what was in them. So complexity thus became a great excuse not to delve into the derivatives that one had bought. And why weren't they held accountable for their absurd debts? This is his argument for why no one went to jail after 2008. The payment system, the simple means of transferring a sum of money from one account to another, and on which every transaction relies, is monopolized by the very same bankers who were making the bets, right? So that was one reason why he's saying they basically had too much power. And then also because the financiers' gambles contain deep inside the title deeds to the houses of the majority. A full-scale financial market collapse would therefore lead to mass homelessness. So this is more of an argument of why we had to bail everybody out. So there's that. And now, let's see, let's do a review. Any questions so far? So we got World War II, we got the technostructure. Technostructure is basically like a centralized planning top-down economy, public-private agreement. What is that all about? Big companies, the ones that are big, are basically in bed with the big finance. And you had the Bretton Woods system, which was loaning money or printing money for Europe and Japan. And I want to say some other. During that time, it was money, American dollars pegged to gold, $35 to the ounce. With all that printing, people started saying, hey, let's go ahead and get and there was capital control. So bankers could not speculate on the currencies. Yeah, the value of Japan, yen, I believe. Yeah, yen, and anything in Europe. Then you had 1971. Around then, you had, besides the other transformations that he points out, we started going off of an attention, kind of economy instead of simple, regular commodities and all this stuff like that, right? So aside from that, the 1971, we started having people wanting to exchange their gold, wherever. Nixon says, nope, let's go ahead and get off of that. And too bad, so sad if you wanted to exchange the gold, for 35 per ounce. And so and then they implemented, another trick. Hey, by the way, if you want to buy anything else, you better buy with dollars first. We already have all these arrangements like oil. It's an easy one to think about. I think that was pretty much a formal agreement that got renewed every, 4 years or 10 years or something. So people had to buy dollars. Countries had to buy dollars. And so they were pegged. United States didn't have to produce much. They reduced wages in the United States for whatever reason. And the capital controls were off, but they were not as strict. But there started being a whole lot more speculation when computers could help in the 2000s, late 90s, 2000s. So they started making things that were so hard to understand that people would just go ahead and, dump money into it and say, well, if it doesn't work, then, the market will decide, and people will just get punished. Obviously, I mean, if you lived through 2008, you saw people were not punished. So,
Hey, Watson, real quick, if you don't mind.
yeah, go
So,
ahead.
so you said that, okay, why would the OPEC countries, agree to this? I mean, what they getting? And you said that, perhaps protection. So I don't know if that's,
If,
I don't know if that's the real motive or the biggest one. And I was just wondering, protection from who,
no, that was a formal agreement. They said they could have weapons and and then we would protect them. That was the agreement.
So weapons, because those countries are not really like, that imperialist, or they have like a big enemy. So why would they want, or they, you know what I mean? It's like in my mind, it's like maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, I mean, now you could talk about us, so Saudi Arabia and Iraq, that they didn't like each other, right? Through the 80s. This is what really happened. Saudi Arabia started doing that sideways drilling into Iraq's oil fields. And Iraq was said, stop that. And they said, no, what are you going to do? We're protected by the United States.
Yeah,
And right.
that's
and
it.
then
I
right.
do it.
Right. So that was one of the things, So the countries over there were really, Europe, England, all this stuff, they were formed kind of like the same deal as Africa, also like Malaysia and all that stuff. The lines were drawn for those countries, they're manufactured to, the idea is that they are purposefully drawn in such a way as to the make the different cultures there fight. So the Sunnis and the Shiites, like putting them right, not giving them their own country, but putting them all in the same country.
Yeah,
That kind of
Kurds
thing.
is also one of the examples.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that kind of thing. And then you've got the resources and all that. So that yeah, any country would love to, you know, have weapons and all the stuff like that, protection, whatever, favored, if not for anything else, but protection from us. We just remember in the 70s, we were doing a coup in Iran. I'm sure Saudi Arabia was like, hey, we don't want you doing that to us.
The good old protection, for
Yeah.
you need my protection. You
Yeah.
really want it.
An offer you can't refuse.
Yeah.
Right. That kind of thing. So yeah. Really I don't know much. This is him going back and forth with his father, this last chapter or this last section. So we're pretty much done. We pretty much the review I did was probably it. So any questions or comments so far? And the next thing we will go over, we're good this time around, but the next one he's going to get into his definition of what cloud is, the cloud capital. He's saying that we're now in feudalism back again. So the next evolution, so there was an evolution of real markets, and then it was like a centrally planned economy that just will happen to have some markets. And then it goes into this other, well, you have a global minotaur, all these weird things that you really couldn't call it capitalism. It's some type of centrally planned, in the United States, to even thinking about, you've heard it so much, you grew up here, like we do not produce anything, very little, and we buy everything. What is that? How can that be? How could that work? And then you could see at a high level, oh, we've engineered to where people have to buy the dollars. Is that capital? Like, what does that have to do with markets? Right? It's centrally planned. Okay. And so, all right. So that's an evolution or critique, but it's still, is it still capitalism if you squint your eyes or whatever? And so now he's saying, oh, yeah, now we're in feudalism when you get to his next critique, or what he's saying is the next evolution. That's why he had to go through all this. I say that it's knowing about Bretton Woods, knowing about 1971, And then kind of just forcing yourself to confront how can a country that has a deficit of producing things be wealthy? How is that possible? And it's through central planning. Oh, okay. And then trying to reconcile that with it's all markets, all the way up and all the way down. Good old capitalism. No, it's centrally planned. So that whole thing, that critique, I think is a pretty solid critique. And then getting into his cloud critique is, very, I think, relevant to the meetup itself. Any other comments, questions, comments?